Hi, I'm Michael Chaskalson and I want to talk to you today about mindfulness for high performance. I'll be sharing some of what I teach when I deliver mindfulness courses, classes, taster sessions and so on in workplace contexts. So let's begin. Imagine you're one of these guys, a lone Marine on checkpoint duty somewhere in Iraq, and a carload of women and children comes driving towards you at high speed without stopping. And in that moment, you have to make a decision. Now, the decision you make could have life or death consequences for yourself or your buddies. It could have life or death consequences for the people in the car. It might have massive international diplomatic and political ramifications. And in that moment, you're just one guy or one girl needing to make a decision. Tough. And the quality of decision that you make in that moment is going to depend to a very large extent on your working memory capacity. So working memory is a bit like the mind's RAM. It's where information first comes into the mind, into the brain, and where it gets initially processed, ready for later, more developed processing. Even as I'm speaking now, the sounds that I make are being held in working memory and assembled into words. The words are held in working memory and assembled into sentences, the sentences into something like a paragraph, and then you know more or less what I'm saying and you can shove that elsewhere for more detailed processing. Working memory is very, very short term and very, very small. It can be just a few bits bigger, a few bits smaller, more or less 8, 9 bits of information at a time. It's tiny, but it refreshes very, very quickly. And what's interesting, of course, is that working memory is degraded by stress, and I'll come back to this in a minute. So working memory is really important. It's essential for effective emotion regulation, for decision making, and for innovation, creativity. It's important for cognitive control, and adequate working memory capacity is really important for effective functioning. This isn't a test of working memory that I'm going to share here. It's not an OSPAN test, which we use when we're trying to measure working memory, but it gives you a sense of what a measurement of working memory looks at, sort of. Name the colors and shapes as quickly as you can, and you'll see there that the red circle is named a red triangle, and the blue square is called a green square. So you're getting information and you're getting interference, you're getting noise. And your capacity to stay focused on the information and kind of filter the noise and to hold the information in mind, the relevant information, and to filter the noise that gets in the way is what memory capacity, working memory capacity is all about. Your capacity to hold relevant information online in the face of competing demands is really important, and it's vital if you're trying to make a decision in a high stress context, especially when the stakes are as high as they are with these guys. And that's why the Marines rolled out mindfulness training, at least trialed mindfulness training for some of their people. Okay, so I want to demonstrate a little bit about how we might measure working memory capacity. In the next slide, name the colors and shapes in the boxes as fast as you can. And as you'll see, you get information, so you get a red circle, and it's called blue square, and you get a blue square, and it's called green square. So you get information and you get contrary information, you get noise. Now, this isn't actually, this Stroop test that I'm showing you here isn't actually a test of working memory capacity. It measures other things, but it gives you a sense of what a working memory test might look like. You can find them online if you're interested. They're kind of fun to do, not easy to capture in a slide. And it's worth having a go and having a look at your working memory capacity and to see whether, if you engage in mindfulness training, it might change. Because the idea that mindfulness training would actually change working memory capacity is something that the Marines got interested in. So they set up a study. They took a cohort of Marines, divided them in two. One half got some mindfulness training, the other half didn't get the mindfulness training. They undertook their training in a high stress context. So this was just before they were being deployed to the battlefield. It was in the period before deployment when, as you can imagine, stresses run very high. There's family issues, there's deployment issues, there's people's own thoughts about what's waiting for them in the battlefield. There's all kinds of stressors present for people. And at that time, they gave some guys and women a mindfulness program. And they measured their working memory capacity before and after the program. And what they found is that those Marines who did more than 12 minutes of mindfulness practice, formal mindfulness practice every day, had an increase in their working memory capacity, despite the fact that all this was taking place in high stress conditions. Those who did less than 12 minutes of mindfulness practice every day, or those who didn't do the mindfulness course, had a decrease in their working memory capacity. So what that seemed to indicate is that mindfulness training could increase people's working memory capacity, even when it's delivered under high stress conditions. And that made a real difference for these people. And I'm very moved by the slide that comes next, because whatever you think about the deployment of soldiers around the world and into different contexts, this next quote for me speaks volumes. So this is a quote from the chief medic to the detachment who did the mindfulness training. And he says, "During my previous deployment, especially after doing multiple missions and being up late, when I'd go out on missions, I'd be so jittery, so fragmented, so ready to pull the trigger, so ready to kill. Without any hesitation, I was ready to go, bloodthirsty, but so amped that there was no control. And thank God nothing happened." This guy's a medic. Whereas after doing the training, he says, so this is the impact that the training had on him, I was focused, I was watching things, I was much more attentive to people who were around me and what they were doing. Before, it was just a blur. So mindfulness training has a powerful impact, it seems, on working memory capacity, and that can have a powerful impact on other elements of one's functioning. But before we go any further with all of this, it's worth talking a little bit about, well, what is mindfulness? Well, what is it? Mindfulness comes from the Buddhist tradition. As far as we're concerned, as far as we know, the Buddha was the first person in history to talk about mindfulness, as I'm using it in this talk. He talked about it as a way of working with your mind and mental states, a way of working with your attention. And he suggested it was something that could be trained. You could be more or less mindful. And he taught a number of practices that enabled people to become more mindful. And for many, many years, for 2,500 years perhaps, those practices lived pretty much largely in Asian monastic contexts, where they were pretty much the preserve of an elite group of male monastics. About 2,500 years ago, they began to emerge in European, North American and other contexts. A very small number of people engaged with that. And that continued until about the 1970s, when we can begin to see the seeds of the current mindfulness boom. And what happened there was a guy called John Kabat-Zinn was working at the University of Massachusetts Medical Center, and he got interested in, how many people leave this hospital with their problems sorted? How many people leave cured, as it were? They come to the hospital because they're suffering. How many people go away with their suffering eliminated? And he got into discussions with physicians and came to the conclusion that it was maybe 20%. That's a low figure. And he was concerned about what happened to the other 80%. Or he was a meditator himself and a yoga teacher, and one day he was on a mindfulness retreat, and there it occurred to him that what he was learning on that retreat would have a real impact on the lives of the other 80%. He persuaded the hospital authorities to give him some space in the basement, and they created what came to be known as the 8-week mindfulness-based stress reduction course. And John's a molecular biologist, a scientist, and he studied outcomes, and they began to find real changes showing up. And I'll talk a little bit about some of those changes later on, but it's because of the research that was undertaken that I'm giving a talk on mindfulness in the workplace, really, because it's helped mindfulness enter secular contexts and come away from the religious context in which it was previously preserved. So these days you can engage with mindfulness training from any perspective, if you like. You don't have to be a Buddhist to do it. It's not no longer at all the preserve of an elite group of male monastics. So what is it? It's a way of working with your attention. It's a quality of awareness, and this comes from John Kabat-Zinn. John speaks of it as the awareness that arises from paying attention, from choosing to pay attention on purpose. So you're paying attention on purpose, choosing where your attention goes. I mean, even as I'm speaking now, even as you're listening to this, I'm sure people's attention is wandering quite a bit. Your mind wanders. Minds are set up to wander. Microsoft recently published some research which suggested that the average attention span in Europe and North America at the moment is around about 16 seconds. The attention span is around about 16 seconds, and that is a reduction on the previously majestic 24 seconds last time they measured. So although minds are generally set up to wander, it seems that our minds are wandering much more than they used to. But when you're mindful, you pay attention on purpose. You choose where your attention goes. And you keep your attention in the present moment. So as I'm speaking, it's quite possible that your mind's wandering off into the future, thinking about what you're going to be doing this afternoon or this evening or tomorrow. Maybe it's wandering off into the past, thinking about something that happened last week in the office or yesterday in the family or on your way into work or whatever. And minds continually wander over time into the future and into the past. When you're mindful, you're paying attention just to this, right here, right now. But this is a really important point. When you're mindful, your attention is non-judgmental. Now, this isn't non-judgmental in the sense that we stop making judgments. We stop discriminating what is useful from not useful, what is good from what is bad, what is appropriate from what is inappropriate. It's not like that. Instead, it's, well, think about the word judgmentalism. What do we mean when we speak about judgmentalism? We speak about something which is very harsh, very hypercritical, very fault-finding. It's that mode of mind which subsides when we're being mindful. I sometimes say that there are two dimensions to this. There's a wisdom dimension and there's a compassion dimension. The wisdom dimension of the non-judgmental aspect of mindfulness is that we choose to allow what is the case to be the case. We begin to allow what is the case to be the case. It's surprising how much energy we all put into not allowing what is the case to be the case. We wish it were not like this. They shouldn't do this. It shouldn't be like that. Why is this turned up now? But you know what? What's here is just what's here. What's shown up is just what's shown up. History has delivered this moment, and it couldn't be anything other than it is. It is what it is. And when we can allow that it is what it is, that what is the case is just the case, then we begin to have some choice. Until we can allow what is the case to be the case, we're kind of stuck. We're stuck into this attitude of refusal or of wanting it to be different or needing it to be other. We can't embrace this moment. And when we can embrace this moment, then we can choose where we go with it. So that's the wisdom element of the non-judgmental aspect of mindfulness, the willingness to allow what is the case to be the case. But there's also a compassion dimension to the non-judgmental element in mindfulness, and that is that when we're mindful in that sense, we begin to some extent to still our inner critical voice. You know, many of us run a kind of critical commentary on ourselves and on others and of the world around us. I'm not good enough, they're not good enough, it's not good enough. It should be somehow other than it is. When we're mindful, when we're non-judgmental in this sense, then we simply allow what's here to be what's here. And we approach it with kindness, with openness, with generosity, and we choose where we're going to go next. Okay, so before I move on, just to do some mindfulness practice, just to share this slide. Many of you will have seen this, I guess, but this shows mindfulness publications by year between 1990 and 2011. So all the time I was practicing ever since 1974, because I lived a great deal of my life in full-time Buddhist practice contexts, urban retreat centers, meditation centers, rural retreat centers, and so on. All of that time there was very little research done on mindfulness, almost none. And when I started studying it academically in 2002, 2003, there were something like 40-odd papers published in that year, and I was amazed. You know, people were beginning to take this stuff seriously. There were scientists were taking it seriously, psychologists were researching it. That was just fantastic. Now there are publications coming out at more or less 50 publications, 50 peer-reviewed journal articles in any month, and that research body is what's allowing us to now take mindfulness into secular contexts. So let's do our first mindfulness practice. Let's do a meditation practice. You can see that there are many different ways of meditating. You could sit cross-legged on the floor. You could sit kneeling on some cushions or a meditation bench. You can get those online. Or you can sit in a chair. And when I teach in organizational contexts, we all sit in chairs, and most of the people I teach go on to continue their mindfulness practice sitting in chairs. It's a perfectly adequate way to meditate. So let's do that now. If you're up for it, you could get yourself set up in a chair, more or less upright, feet square on the floor. You could keep your hands in your lap, or you could have your palms one on top of the other, or your hands just resting on your thighs, whatever feels comfortable. The main thing is to be symmetrical, upright, alert, dignified, not straining. So just perhaps taking a moment or two to find a posture that works for you, if you'd like to spend the next 5 or 6 minutes meditating with me now. And if you'd care to, perhaps look away from the screen. Now you could let your eyes close, as I will, or you could leave them open. It doesn't much matter. If you're leaving them open, perhaps just look at something which isn't changing, isn't shifting, and let your gaze soften. So just taking your time to get set up, and we'll begin by bringing attention away from thinking. So moving the attention away from thinking, coming down to sensations at the feet. And perhaps just noticing what's here right now, down at your feet. Any sense of touch, of pressure, contact. Maybe a sense of constriction from shoes, or a sense of contact with socks, or maybe bare feet in contact with the floor, whatever's here. Just noticing. And there's nothing you should be feeling here, there's just what you happen to be feeling, sensing, and just noticing that. And then, if it's okay for you, moving attention to the sensations where your body meets the chair, exploring those sensations for a few moments, touch, pressure, contact. Becoming aware of sensations at your hands, sensations in the rest of your body, and beginning to become aware of the sense of the body breathing. So just feeling this body, this moment, this breath. Maybe locating the sensations that come along with each in-breath, the sensations that come along with each out-breath. And just beginning to allow your attention to rest with the breath. As best you can, just bringing a warm, kindly curiosity to what you find as the breath comes in and what you find as the breath goes out. And staying with the sensations of breathing as best you can. Now, the mind will wander. It's what minds do, and it's not a mistake. It's not a fault. But when you find that your mind has wandered, just noticing where it went, just saying, you might say, oh yeah, there's thinking, or there's planning, and then gently, kindly drawing the attention back to the breath. Each in-breath, each out-breath. And when the mind wanders, just noticing, just seeing where it goes, and gently, kindly drawing attention back to the breath. Just following the breath. Just breathing. So we can begin to bring that practice to a close now. There's no rush, just taking your time. You need to give yourself some time to change mode after a meditation practice. So just giving yourself whatever time you need. When you're ready in your own time, opening your eyes and coming to move. Okay, so when we meditate like that, when we follow the breath in that way, the mind wanders. And it's quite possible that you've had an idea about what you should be doing as we were doing that practice. It's quite possible that taking a look at the slide here, you think that the really important thing, the chief task, is to keep your attention in the bandwidth marked out by the arrow. And that if your mind wanders out of that bandwidth, then you're doing it wrong. So you need to keep your attention really with the breath, and when your mind moves from the breath, you're kind of blowing it. That would be a very natural way to think about the process we've engaged in. But what most people find is that their mind goes on a journey, their attention goes on a journey. We start out by following the breath, and we follow the breath for 2 breaths, for 3 breaths, and then we forget. we forget to follow the breath, and we forget to keep our attention there, and our attention wanders off. So there's a sound outside the room and our attention wanders off to that, and we get involved in that and we think about that, and then we remember. We remember and we draw our attention back, and we draw our attention back to the breath, and that's fairly easy to do. We can all do that, and we follow the breath for 2 breaths, 3 breaths, maybe even 4 breaths, hey? And then we forget, and we decide to start to think about something else, and we find ourselves thinking, and we're thinking and thinking and thinking, and then, hey, we remember. And so we do a lot of forgetting and remembering to follow the breath, to pay attention to the breath. We do that over and over. And there are 3 domains around which we forget and remember. We forget and remember to pay attention. But also we forget and remember our intention. We set out with the intention of following the breath, but maybe after a few breaths we forget that intention. We think, hey, I've got some space, I can do some planning, and we start to plan and we plan and we plan, and then we remember. We remember our intention to pay attention to the breath, and we bring our attention back. It's easy to do, and we follow the breath for another few breaths, and then we forget. We lose our intention to follow the breath, and we set up an intention to do some dreaming, or at least we just lose our intention to pay attention, and we start to dream. And we dream and we dream and we dream, and then we remember our intention, and we bring our attention back to the breath. But there's also the question of attitude. It's quite possible that just after a few breaths you start giving yourself a hard time. You start to think, oh my God, I can't do this. This is crazy. I was just trying to follow the breath. This isn't rocket science. I should be able to do it. What's so hard about this? I can't stop my mind. I can't stop my thoughts. And you start to beat yourself up. And then you remember the attitude. There's this attitude that we're trying to develop, attitudes of kindness, of curiosity, of interest, a whole bunch of desirable attitudes. We're trying to bring this sort of non-judgmental attitude, of an attitude of not being attached to outcomes, an attitude of just accepting what shows up, an attitude of kindness, of openness, curiosity, trust, and non-reactivity. So we forget and remember the attitude over and over again. So we forget and remember to pay attention, we forget and remember our intention, and we forget and remember the attitude. And now what's really interesting is that this isn't wrong. In some ways it's kind of right, because every time we forget is an opportunity to remember. And every time we remember, it's as if you're laying down very tiny drops, if you like, in the neural pathways connected with sustained attention, sustained intention, and a new set of attitudes. You're beginning to build the neural pathways connected with those qualities. Now, if you do that just a few times, it makes very little difference. It makes hardly any difference at all. If you do that 10,000 times, you begin to build a new kind of brain. You begin to build new neural resources. So we know that, with 8 weeks of mindfulness training, there seems to be a correlation between people who've done 8 weeks of mindfulness training and increased brain grey matter density in areas connected with sustained attention, emotion regulation, cognitive control, for example. There seems to be a correlation between people who do 8 weeks of mindfulness training and increased left prefrontal cortex activation, reduced right prefrontal cortex activation. I'll talk more about that in a short time. There seems to be a correlation between people who do 8 weeks of mindfulness training and increased activity in the insula. And the insula is one of the brain systems which is very important for empathy and for knowing what's going on in our own bodies and in other people's bodies and minds. So with 8 weeks of mindfulness training, the mind wanders and comes back, it wanders and we bring it back, it wanders and we bring it back, maybe 10,000 times. And that begins to develop real resources. It's a kind of brain training, you might say. Okay, so what are the things that might be impacted here by mindfulness training? Let's have a look at what happens when we're subjected to a challenge. What happens when we're put under pressure? You'll see on the slide here that when we're subjected to a challenge, our capacity to respond to that challenge goes up. So along the bottom of this slide, you see increased levels of pressure. We're being subjected to increased levels of pressure. And as the level of demand on us increases, so our capacity to respond to that demand increases. This is true of all human beings. You know, you give people a challenge and they, to some extent, rise to the occasion. We rise to the occasion. It's true of all organisms. If you're growing, say you're living in the northern hemisphere and you're a keen gardener and you're growing peas and you don't want them to be subjected to frost, so you're growing them indoors on a windowsill in the winter. And if you were to rub your hand across the top of the pea shoots every day, they grow stronger. And that's not because peas love human beings and really respond to the warmth and affection. It's because you're subjecting them to a challenge. You're subjecting them to a stressor, a very minor stressor, and that's in response to that, their cells get agitated and they develop greater strength. So they develop stronger roots, stronger stems, bigger leaves. It's great. But if you were to take your hand and you were whack it down on the pea plants, you kill them all. So a certain amount of challenge is good for us. Too much challenge, really bad for us. So you can see that in the graph here. Certain amount of, if we're not getting enough challenge, we're disengaged, we can't be bothered, we don't have enough responsibility, we don't do well. That's bad for our health. In the next section, we're thriving, we're doing really well. There's a lovely balance between the demands that are made on us and our capacity to respond to those demands. And then in the next section, we get stressed. And that's a bad place to be. In this place of stress, there's cancer, heart disease, diabetes, musculoskeletal disorders, eating disorders, digestive disorders, sleep disorders, and so on. It's a really bad place to be. Stress, prolonged stress, really does kill. It shortens the lifespan. Not good for you. You'll see there's a dotted line there, and that dotted line marks out the zone of delusion. And it's in that place where people think they're doing well, but they're not. They think they're thriving, but they're not. They think they can just keep on taking it on, but they can't. There are no supermen, no superwomen. This curve is true of all organisms. Now, what's really interesting about this curve is somewhere near the top of it, there's this place, you know, before we fall off very rapidly, which is actually what happens when we're stressed. Performance falls off very rapidly. When we're mindful, we can catch the signs of it. We can notice the signs of stress in our body and in our behavior. We notice that we're getting more short-tempered. We notice that our jaw's beginning to clench, that we're beginning to get a headache, that our stomach's starting to churn, that we're losing sleep. We notice these things, and with mindfulness practice, there are things we can do about that. There are methods, strategies we can institute to help us to come back down the curve, back into a place of thriving. So that's the promise of mindfulness training in relation to the pressure performance curve. I'll just talk a little bit about Transport for London. They put on a mindfulness course for the people, for people who are stressed at work, suffering absenteeism due to stress at work, and delivering journeys in London is very highly stressful. And what they found after 3 years, this is data published by the Mental Health Foundation, is that people had increased resilience. Their days off for stress, anxiety, and depression fell by 71%. Absences for all conditions halved, and 80% reported improvement in their relationships. 64% told of improvements in sleep patterns, and over half said they were happier at work. Now, this is a longer term study, and it shows what happened to people after 6 years after the intervention. As you can see, they get the intervention in year 1, and then in years 2, 3, 4, 5, things just get better for them. In the final year, I'm told there was a major internal reorganization that might account for the increased levels of stress there. But what it seems is that when people learn to work with their minds and their mental states in a different way, things go better for them. And that's very, very promising. Mindfulness training is a way of learning to work differently with your mind and your mental states, learning to be more choiceful around what happens with your mind and your mental states. It's a wonderful skill to have. I'm always fascinated by this study. It's the response study that was carried out by these august institutions. It was led by INSEAD in the Paris-based business school, with a number of other august institutions. And what they were interested in was understanding and responding to social demands for corporate responsibility. How could you train managers to make socially responsible decisions? So they got together with a number of global organizations, trialed a number of different interventions, and the results were really quite astonishing. This is what they found. This comes from the executive summary to their report. They found that the standard executive education approach based on engaged discussions and case analyses fails to facilitate managers to shift towards higher probabilities to make socially responsible decisions. You can tell people why they ought to be socially more responsible. Of course, we all know that we ought to be socially more responsible, but telling us just doesn't do the trick. Just sort of taking in more cognitive information doesn't really change our behavior. We know that. We know that we should go to the gym, we should eat more healthily. We know all the things we should do, but we tend not to. On the other hand, they found coaching programs based on introspection and meditation techniques without any discussion on CSR topics, that is, without any discussion on corporate social responsibility, exhibit a significant impact on both the probability to act in a socially responsible way and on the factors that influence the probability to behave in that way. In other words, they found just teaching people to meditate increased their levels of care and concern. That's what they found. Their levels of care and concern went up. And when their levels of care and concern went up, so their inclination to make socially responsible decisions changed. And that's really heartening. Okay, let's move on. So here we see Richie Davidson, who's we could think of as the father or one of the fathers of the neuroscientific research into meditation, and a guy called Mathieu Ricard, who's a Tibetan Buddhist monk, who's one of the sometimes said to be the happiest man in the world. And they were doing a study, and Richie was really interested in, well, what happens when you take a really experienced meditator like Mathieu, who'd at this stage done more than 30 years of very, very, very intensive meditation practice. I think it was more than 30,000 hours of practice. What would be the impact on left-right prefrontal cortex activation? So left prefrontal cortex is associated with openness, curiosity, kindness, innovation, an approach mode of mind, moving towards, open, kindly, interested, engaged. Right prefrontal activation, on the other hand, is associated with fear, disgust, anxiety, aversion. The prefrontal is this area just behind the forehead. So left prefrontal activation, you're approach-oriented. Right prefrontal activation, you're avoidance-oriented. And what they found was that after looking at Mathieu's left to right prefrontal activation, that he had a level of left prefrontal activation entirely off the charts. Just completely never before seen in science. It was just remarkable. So they wondered, well, what would happen if we delivered an 8-week mindfulness training to just an ordinary group of people, and they recruited a bunch of people from a nearby biotech company in Madison, Wisconsin, where Richie was working, and gave half of them an 8-week mindfulness course, the other half got the course later, and they measured left to right prefrontal activation before and after the course. What they found is that after the training, left prefrontal activation had increased in the mindfulness trained cohort. There were more left prefrontal activation, activated, more approach-oriented. And that persisted at a 4-month or 3-month follow-up, I can't quite remember. And it was associated with an increase in antibodies. So they gave all of them a flu jab, and those of them who had done the mindfulness training produced more antibodies in relation to the in response to the flu jab. So what they found though was that mindfulness training significantly changed people's biological setup, and it increased their left prefrontal activation. It made them more approach-oriented. And that has interesting consequences for creativity and innovation. This is really important. So here's a study that's often done with psychology students. You take a group of students and you divide them into two groups, and you give one half one maze and the other half another maze. And the mazes are identical, but for one half they've got to get the mouse out of the maze to get the cheese, and for the other half they've got to get the mouse out the maze to avoid the owl. And off they go, and they draw their pathway to get the mouse out the maze, and they do it more or less at the same rate. So you think you're getting nowhere. You then ask them standard creativity test, come up with innovative uses of a brick, and they both come up with the same number of innovations, more or less. So you think you're kind of getting nowhere. I mean, you then ask independent experts to rate the innovations on a scale of 1 to 10. And this is where it gets really interesting, because, use a brick to build a wall, not particularly innovative, maybe give that 1. Use a brick to make a stage so a band of performing mice can put on a concert. Maybe that gets a 10. So I don't know, maybe it's an 8 actually. You think about that. These independent experts, however, rating these innovations, rate the cheese guys, the approach guys, 50% more innovative. Now that's really interesting. So it seems that that tiny tilt towards approach and away from avoidance, that tiny tilt increases people's capacity for innovation really considerably. And that's, again, really heartening, because we seem to know that mindfulness training increases left prefrontal activation, increases approach orientation, and perhaps then sets us up to be more creative, more innovative. Okay, I begin to draw to a close now, but I just want to share this before I go away. These are our emotion regulation systems. This is based on the work of Paul Gilbert, who himself takes it from Depew, Moroni, Strapinski. It seems that there are 3 systems that govern our emotional lives. There's the blue system, the red system, the green system. In the blue system, the big player is dopamine, and it's reward seeking. It's what gets us out of bed in the morning. At its crudest, it's what gets us to look for a mate and to feed our family. That's, way back in evolutionary history, that's where this stuff comes from. So it's the reward seeking system. The red system is the threat focused and safety seeking system. Adrenaline, noradrenaline, cortisol, it's what keeps us safe. It's the system that gets us activated to stay safe. And the green system, where the big players are serotonin, oxytocin, maybe vasopressin, is the calm and connect system. And as we go through our day, we move through each of these 3 systems over and over again. So we'll experience a bit of threat, we'll take some evasive behavior, we'll connect with other people, the green system comes into play, we'll do our work at the office or whatever our place of work is, and when we're trying to get on, it's the blue system at work. And they work kind of together. Now, if you think about these 3 systems, they kind of are biological inheritance. They come from many millions of years of evolution. So we've been evolving as human beings over a very, very long period of time, but we've lived in settled civilization for 10,000 years. We've had the internet for, I don't know, usable for everyone, 7 years, 6, I don't know how long everyone's had the internet for. Smartphones, what, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, max, perhaps, I don't know. So we've not really caught up. We've not caught up with, our evolution hasn't caught up. These systems haven't caught up with the kinds of lives we live today. If you take us back, say, 40,000 years, and we're, say you're living in Britain 40,000 years ago. So you're living in the forest, in a clearing in the forest with a very small band of people. You pretty much know everyone, 40, 50, 60 people, perhaps max in this forest band, and you're living by hunting, by foraging, getting by. and you're trying to stay safe, so you're trying to keep yourself more or less in the clearing, but some of the time you have to go into the forest to forage, to hunt, and the forest's a place of danger. So, but you've got to feed your family, so you head out into the forest to forage for berries and nuts and other food, or to hunt, and maybe one day you're out there and you get a sense that, oh, there's a bear behind that rock. So what do? Well, one of the first things you do is you freeze. You don't want to alert the bear to your presence, so you freeze. Adrenaline and noradrenaline shoot through the system. Cortisol gets activated. Adrenaline's raising our heart rate, pumping the large muscle groups of blood so we're ready to fight or run away. Noradrenaline's performing similar kinds of acts. Cortisol's getting us ready to rapidly activate. It's thickening our blood, and it's an anti-inflammatory, so it's great if we're bitten or bruised. Helps us to recover more quickly. It's undermining our immune system, but hey, that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you get a cold next week. Right now there's a bear behind that rock. That's the important thing. We stop digesting. We don't want to waste energy on digestion if there's a bear behind the rock. We breathe very shallow. We're ready to fight. We're ready to run. Non-essential neural circuits shut down. We don't want to be thinking, does energy really equal mass multiplied by the speed of light squared? If there's a bear behind that rock, fight, run. That's what you need to be able to do. Okay, so we get on with that. We fight, run, we do whatever we need to do, and we escape from the bear. We come back to the family campfire with our kill, and people are cooking meat, having a good time, making up songs and dances about our legendary escape from the bear. It's all really wonderful. People are feeling great. We're calm, we're connected. Serotonin's making people feel good. Oxytocin's helping us all to bond. Vasopressin's bringing down the heart rate. So this really works in this context. But this system is exactly the same system that we bring to work today. So your boss stops by your desk and says something slightly cutting, and in that moment, the whole threat system kicks off. And right now, you stop breathing, you stop digesting, you stop moving, non-essential neural circuits cut down, your large muscle groups pump up with blood, ready to fight or run away. You stop digesting, you can't think straight, and you get completely thrown. This is just not helpful. This legacy system that we bring to the current circumstance is really not helping us very much right now. Much better to do our blue striving stuff from the green zone, from a green space. Much better to do that in a calm and connected sort of way. And this is really important for leaders, because leaders' emotions are contagious. We watch leaders like hawks. And if they spend their time in the green zone, if a leader is threatened and is anxious, and they just spread threat and anxiety through their team. If a leader is calm and connected, they help their team to feel calm and connected. You get anxious workplaces and you get calm and connected workplaces. Mindfulness training helps us to manage that axis, the axis between red and green. It helps us to notice when we're getting a bit red. It helps us to become green again. It helps us to notice when there's a bit of owl on our horizon. It helps us to turn a bit more towards the cheese. So it helps us to calm, to connect, and to do our work from that place. So I say, well, leaders sometimes say to me, I need my people to be a bit threatened. I need them to be a bit anxious. It brings out the best in them. I don't think it does. You need your people to be blue. You need them to be reward-seeking. You need them to be wanting to get on, wanting to do well, wanting to do best for themselves, for society, for their families. But you don't need them to be threatened and anxious. You need them to do that from the green zone, from a place which is calm and connected. And that's something that mindfulness training can help us to do. It can help us to feel calm and connected, and to do our blue striving from the green place rather than from a red place. So in a moment or two, I'm going to just teach a 1-minute meditation, which you can do for yourself anytime when you need to change mode. Before then, I'd just like to read a poem. So this is a poem I've got in my book the Mindfulness in 8 Weeks, quick plug. It's called The Autobiography in 5 Short Chapters. It's by Portia Nelson. And it's about the process of change, making changes. She says, I walk down the street. There's a deep hole in the sidewalk. I fall in. I'm lost. I'm hopeless. It isn't my fault. It takes forever to find a way out. I walk down the same street. There's a deep hole in the sidewalk. I pretend I don't see it. I fall in again. I can't believe I'm in the same place. But it isn't my fault. It still takes a long time to get out. 3. I walk down the same street. There's a deep hole in the sidewalk. I see it is there. I still fall in. It's a habit. My eyes are open. I know where I am. It is my fault. I get out immediately. 4. I walk down the same street. There's a deep hole in the sidewalk. I walk around it. 5. I walk down another street. You can make changes. Okay, let's do a mindful minute. In this meditation, we'll do a meditation similar to the one we did earlier, but I'm going to teach a meditation that you can do in just 1 minute, because everyone's got a minute to spare. So before you have to make an important phone call, you can do a mindful minute to change mode. After a difficult meeting, you can do a mindful minute to change mode. If you're feeling frazzled at work, you can do a mindful minute to get yourself calm again. When you come home in the evening, you can do a mindful minute before walking through the door. So you leave work behind and come home ready to greet whatever's there in a fresh sort of way. So let's get ourselves set up for meditation. And what we're going to do is just begin to meditate as we did earlier. And what we'll do is we'll begin to follow the breath. Each in-breath, each out-breath, just as we did earlier. But after a while, I'll say start. And when I say start, just begin to count your breaths at the end of the out-breath. You breathe in, you breathe out, count 1. Breathe in, breathe out, count 2. Breathe in, breathe out, count 3. And just keep going like that. After a minute has passed, I'll say stop. And when I say stop, remember the number you stopped on. Okay, so just getting yourself set up, getting ready to meditate, feet square on the floor, upright, alert, dignified. And just beginning to follow each in-breath and each out-breath. Just following the breath. And in a moment or two, I'll say start, and when I do, just beginning to count at the end of the out-breath. Start. And stop. And just remembering the number you stopped on, and that's how many breaths you take in a mindful minute. So just giving yourself a moment or two to adjust, and then we'll talk about next steps. So for next steps, you can do the mindful minute a few times a day. That can really be helpful. You might want to take a look at other resources, such as my book, Mindfulness in 8 Weeks, which is an 8-week mindfulness course laid on. At the back of the book at www.mbsr.co.uk/mp31.php, there's a set of audio instructions that you could follow. But just generally, do what you can to stay mindful. Keep yourself as best you can in the present moment, and look out for some mindfulness training. If you can join a course or a class and get yourself some training, it can make a real difference to your life. Thank you very much for listening.